All right, whenever you are ready.
Okay, so thank you very much and welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Bruno Barrio Nuevo. I'm a research associate at Geosense, which is one of the partners of the Icaerus project, and we're here to present today the environmental impact assessment of the Icaerus use cases and its and their solutions. Let me give you very briefly an overview of the project. Icaerus stands for Innovation Capacity Building in Agriculture, Environmental and Rural UAV Services. It is a Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Action that started in July 2022 and will be finishing very soon. This project brings together partners from different European countries, and you can see in the map, with the purpose of exploring the potential of drones as tools in different agricultural and rural settings. As we said, the project will be finishing very soon, and it's been focused on developing use cases in real settings, building capacity, and supporting sustainable practices through the use of UAV technologies. And this last part is the one we're mainly focusing on about today. And overall, the project aims to strengthen rural ecosystems and integrating advanced drone solutions in a more practical, useful, and meaningful way. Very briefly, again, as we said, the project has focused on developing real life use cases. We have 5 of them that we'll be looking at today: crop monitoring in Spain, livestock monitoring in France, spray in Greece, rural logistics in North Macedonia, and forestry and biodiversity monitoring in Lithuania. Now, before we get into the interesting part of this webinar, which is the results that we've obtained through our studies, let's try to look briefly at what sustainability really means in practice. In projects like Icaerus, we often use and describe solutions as sustainable. In practice, however, this concept is not always that straightforward. In the sense that it's not composed of one single indicator, but it's a combination of things, as we'll see in a second. So, for example, a system might reduce emissions during its operation, which is a good thing for the environment, but require more materials to build some of the technology. Or it may be cost efficient, but worsen the environmental impact in some other areas. So what I want to say with this is that sustainability is not a single outcome, as we make it sound sometimes, but it involves trade-offs, and those depend many times on what we choose to measure. Now, that said, one of the key challenges when we talk about sustainability is not so much defining it, but measuring it properly. We need methodological approaches that allows us to capture trade-off between different aspects, compare solutions in a consistent way, and provide credible, transparent results that are useful and meaningful for decision makers and also stakeholders. And this is particularly important in projects like Icaerus, where we are evaluating or trying to evaluate the introduction of a relatively new technology like drones in different agricultural and rural settings. So if we try to frame the concept of sustainability, we need to say that it's based on 3 main dimensions: the environmental, the economic, and the social. All 3 dimensions are very important and interconnected. And actually, as you can see in the figure there, sustainability is defined as the part of where the 3 dimensions overlap. And that's what we've been trying to look at Icaerus. We've performed an assessment for each of the dimensions, for each of the use cases. In this webinar, however, we'll be focusing only on one of them, which is the environmental dimension. And here, within this dimension, the question becomes, how do we assess environmental performance in a way that it's robust and meaningful? To assess environmental sustainability properly, we need a methodology that goes beyond a single stage or indicator. And this is where comes into play life cycle assessment, or LCA for short, which is a which is a methodology that allows us to quantify environmental impacts across different life stages of a product or service, from raw material extraction, transformation, transport, operation, up to the end of life, and across a wide range of different categories of impact. In Icaerus, we have applied LCA to evaluate our 5 use cases in which drone technology has been implemented for different agricultural and rural activities. But before we move on to the actual results, let me briefly show you how this LCA methodology actually works in practice. I'll try to keep it very simple. It's not about getting all the aspects. It's more about having a general idea of how we went from implementing these use cases to obtaining the results that we'll see later on. Now, at its core, LCA is about somehow tracking, if you want, everything that goes into a production system that produces a product or provides a service, and everything that comes out. On the input side, we have things like any materials, energy, water, all those things we need to produce our product or provide our service. While on the other side, what comes out of the system involves our main product or service and any co-products, any form of waste, as well as any kind of emission, which can take different forms to air, soil, water. So with this methodology, we try to look at the entire life cycle of whatever we are studying, in the sense that we'll take into account different stages of its life and not just the now. And in this way, LCA allows us to capture somehow hidden impacts that are not so obvious at first sight and that otherwise would be missed or not contemplated. Now, but how does this work? How do we go from these inputs and outputs to the actual environmental impacts? I can try to summarize this process in 4 main stages. First of all, we collect the relevant data from our systems relative to all those inputs and outputs with their amounts. Then we use specialized software where we can introduce what we call model this information there and identify, by connecting with existing LCA databases, identify all the substances that are involved with each input. For instance, you may be using one chemical that you think is one simple thing, but inside this chemical has a long list of different substances. So we have the identification of all those. Based on this, we translate these flows into emissions. These flows of substances can be converted into different forms of emissions. And based on this, we will link these emissions by applying a characterization factor into the different categories of impact that we are contemplating. Finally, with all this, we aggregate it and generate results that we can interpret and compare. You can see here a figure that tries to simplify this process for the sake of understanding it at this level. I'm going to show you another figure, which is a bit scary, maybe. Don't worry, you don't need to understand every detail. It's just to show in a graphic way how things can get complicated pretty fast. So actually, the list of emissions can be very long. Each of these emissions can connect to different categories of impact. So the number of calculations is quite high. And eventually, with these categories of impact, you can present them in different ways as well, in a more comprehensive list or in a more reduced or group way. For the sake of our presentation today, we'll be working mainly with the third column, which is the damage identification, damage assessment level. But don't worry about these technicalities. Now, very briefly, how have we applied this methodology within the specific context of Icaerus? Let's say that we analyze our 5 very different use cases because each of them had its own characteristics, conventional systems, and different levels of data availability. Because of this, the first important step at the beginning of the project was to carefully study and define the goal and scope for each of these studies, particularly in terms of methodological aspects like the functional unit, which is the reference to which we compare, and system boundaries. These were not identical for each use case, precisely because each of them is quite different. So we did an effort to try to select methodological aspects that are more relevant for each use case and make our comparison with a conventional system more meaningful. Now, once the scope and the goal was defined, we moved to building the lifecycle inventory. This involved collecting data directly from the use cases in terms of materials, energy use, transport, operational activities, etc., with their amounts in order to create these input-output inventories. As is often the case in these case studies, these steps require making some assumptions because you don't always have all the data, but we try always to be very transparent with those choices. Once we had these inventories, we move on to modeling, we call it, using specialized self-CA software, in our case, SIMA Pro, which is the one that allowed us to connect our primary data with background databases and add all the information about previous steps in the production of our inputs. From these models, we proceeded to the calculation, the actual doing of all these mathematical calculations at different levels in order to capture the combined effect of impacts through the whole life cycle considered. And finally, with all this information, which is quite considerable, we did an effort of interpretation of the results in order to identify the main contributors to the different impact categories, do this comparison between a drone system against a conventional way of doing the same activity, and understanding where the key impacts actually occur. So basically, this workflow that I try to explain took us from the obtention of the primary case-specific data to comparable environmental insights, which is the part that I will now present in the next section. So, I'm not sure if no, it changed. As we said, Icaerus work on 5 practical use cases. We have analyzed the 5 different use cases, each of them representing distinct applications of drone technologies in agricultural and rural context. These include, as you can see here, crop health monitoring, drone spraying, livestock monitoring, forestry monitoring, and rural logistics. We will be presenting and looking at today at the results for the first use cases. The 5th use case in rural logistics is still undergoing some refinements, particularly in terms of some of the modeling choices. So that's why we prefer not to include it here, but the results will be included in the report that will be ready very soon and eventually be made public. So anyone interested will be able to get that information as well. So with that in mind, let us start with the first use case. We have use case 1, which focuses, as we said, on crop health monitoring in vineyards. Here, we compare a conventional in-field monitoring of this crop with a UAV or drone-based monitoring and diagnosis system. The functional unit, the reference for comparison, is the monitoring and diagnosis of 1 hectare of vineyard during one growing season. And the system boundary doesn't contemplate the whole life cycle. It's from the cradle, from the beginning of the whole process up to the gate of the service when the service finishes. So we're leaving the end of life part. A key point in this case is that the diagnosis for this specific case directly influence the amount of plant protection products that would be required to treat this field, which we'll see it's quite important in terms of environmental impacts. So what we are really assessing here is how improving diagnosis through precision agriculture technology like UAVs can affect the environmental profile of these practices. And in terms of the results, what we found, I know here there's a lot of information, let me walk you through it. Now, with LCA, we look up to 16 different categories of impact. Here, I put you just 8 that were the more relevant, I believe, since the space and time matter is important. So here, what are we seeing? One important thing before I get into the specific results when it comes to LCA results is that it doesn't always or often give us a single good or bad answer. Instead, since we look at so many different environmental impact categories, results are often not black and white, but involve trades-off. And this is exactly what we're seeing here. On the one hand, we see that the drone system performs significantly better in most of the impact categories, but especially in the four that you see at the top that are related to aspects of toxicity, ecotoxicity, and acidification. These improvements are largely driven, let's say, by the more precise use of plant protection products in the UAV system, meaning we need less chemicals. On the other hand, and as you can see at the bottom, we also see the opposite trend, if you want, in some other categories, like climate change, fossil resource use, or ionizing radiation, where the drone system performs worse than the conventional system. And this is mainly due to the additional technology involved, the drone in itself, with all its components, battery, and energy, electricity in this case, need for charging the UAV and processing the data. Now, important to take into account here that when working with UAVs, specifically a very important part of their environmental impacts have to do with their lifespan. The lifespan of a UAV can be difficult to determine because many aspects come into play here. So we consider a couple scenarios, a more conservative and a more optimistic one, to try and see what would be the effect when extending the lifespan of the drone. So when we do that, when we move from a shorter drone lifespan to a longer, we do see some improvements. The impacts associated with manufacturing the drone are spread over a larger period, and this produces an improvement in some of these categories. However, this alone is not enough to fully outperform the conventional system, especially in the four categories that you see at the bottom, where the drone system still would perform worse. However, we consider that since the drone system is including or introducing this important use of electricity, we wanted to explore a new scenario in which all this electricity would come not from the grid, but from a greener renewable energy source like PV. So when we combine this longer lifespan with renewable electricity from photovoltaic energy, we see that there's an additional improvement. Here you in the graphs can see it in the purple as compared to the green. So not in all categories the improvement is considerable, but we see in resource use, fossils, and ionizing radiation, and also climate change, we can obtain an improvement. Again, for these four categories, this is not enough to outperform the conventional system, but it shows the way towards further improvement. Now, the takeaways here is that the UAV system can deliver strong environmental benefits, but that the final environmental performance depends heavily on how this is implemented, particularly in terms of equipment lifespan and energy use. Now, in order to understand a little bit better these results, I present you here what we call hotspot analysis that shows us what drives the impacts. In the conventional system that you have on the left, you can see that impacts are largely dominated by plant protection products, mainly because this conventional system relies on a more homogeneous, if you want, diagnosis and later on application of chemicals. In the drone system, this changes a little bit. The chemical impacts decrease proportionally, but a new important contributor appears, which is the drone in itself that you can see in green in the right side, but also from the electricity that we're going to need to charge the batteries and to process the data. So we see a fundamental shift from a system driven by chemicals in the more conventional system to a one driven more by technology, and energy. And this explains our results. We reduce impacts from inputs when we use drones, but introduce impacts related to technology and energy. Now, that's the main reason why factors that we mentioned, like lifespan and energy source, become so important, because they can be applied specifically to those categories where these aspects are more important and allow us to further improve later on our environmental profile. Overall, let's say that this helps understand not just how much impact there is in the whole system, but where it comes from, which is probably a very relevant aspect. Now, very briefly, in terms of conclusion here, for use case one, the UAV system can reduce impacts, and it does across most of the impact categories, thanks to a more precise diagnosis that can reduce the need for chemical inputs. However, these benefits come with trade-offs related to the manufacturing and energy use of the drone and data processing. Extending the drone lifespan helps, but it's not enough in itself. An additional help can be found through the use of alternative greener renewable energy sources. So all in all, the environmental benefit is not inherent to the technology in itself. It depends on how the technology is designed and operationalized. So this is in terms of the general conclusions. Let me make, however, also an important note in terms of limitations that will help us understand better these results. It's important to say that this study doesn't factor in or consider or accounts for the diagnosis effectiveness or yield impacts of these different ways of monitoring and diagnosing, which can be a very important part. Unfortunately, within this project wasn't possible to do this due to some limitations in the way we implemented the two systems. So again, this is a very important aspect and probably a field of further research in the future that could be quite interesting. Now, moving on to use case two on drone spraying. Here again, we are comparing a conventional spraying system of a vineyard with a tractor-mounted air blast and a UAV or drone spraying system. The functional unit here is the treatment of 1 hectare over a full growing season, and we use again this approach from the beginning, when we extract all the materials up to the service gate and not the following stages. We compare this conventional system against 3 UAV configurations that consider different application efficiency and drone lifespan. Again, I will explain about this. Now, a key point here is that, unlike in use case one, the amount of plant protection products that are sprayed is considered the same across the different scenarios. So the comparison focuses mainly on how the spraying is performed, energy use and infrastructure, and also emission patterns, which I will explain, which I think is quite interesting. Now, looking at the results, again, we have these graphs in which we try to put the result for each of the 4 scenarios. We have in blue the conventional, in red the drone system with a shorter lifespan, but with optimized application. I will explain this. In green, we have a drone system with a longer lifespan, but with suboptimal application. And in purple, a UAV system, again, with the longer lifespan, but with optimal application. Now, looking at the results, again, we don't have a black and white answer. We have a nuanced answer with trade-offs. That said, use case 2 shows a very clear, if you want, overall trend, and it is that across most categories, UAV spraying performs significantly better than conventional systems. These improvements are mainly driven by the replacement of diesel-based tractor operations with electricity, which is the one mainly used drones, which is much less energy intensive. We also see strong reductions in areas like water use, land use, and air pollution related impacts such as acidification. At the same time, however, within the UAV scenarios, we see that they perform worse still in a number of impact categories, and it's the 5 you can see at the bottom. Within these 3 UAV scenarios, a very important part or interesting aspect was for us to explore different application methods. Why? Basically, we have one that represents a more optimized spraying approach, which allows for better control of the flight conditions and uses some buffer zones to reduce the drift. And another that represents what eventually is a less efficient, maybe, with a higher drift and less control over where the spray ends up. This is important because we wanted to explore this compared to the air blast sprayers, which behave differently in the way they distribute chemicals. So air blast systems tend to generate significant of target drift, meaning that some of these chemicals can disperse into the surrounding environment. UAVs, on the other hand, can reduce that drift, but this also means that a larger share of the product may end up not in the surrounding area, but within the field, particularly on the soil. And this is where we see a very interesting aspect or finding here that has to do with freshwater ecotoxicity. We see here that the green one, which is the UAV application with suboptimal application, shows a big increase in this impact. However, this is not because more chemicals are used. It is mainly due to how they are distributed and how emissions are distributed into the different compartments of the environment. So with more substance reaching the soil in this suboptimal application, there is a higher deposition of this chemical on the soil and a higher potential for transport to water bodies through runoff. When it comes to the more optimal application, however, we see a very small difference compared to the conventional system. Because essentially we are not increasing the total emissions between these two forms of spraying. What we are doing is a redistribution of them between the different environmental compartments, which are the soil, the water, and the air. So this kind of help explains why the patterns look different across some of these impact categories. In addition to all this, we also look at the effect of extending the drone lifespan. And what we see is, again, that the longer lifespan improve slightly the results, particularly in those categories linked to the manufacturing of the drone, since we are going to spread those impacts over a longer period. However, in general, in this use case, this effect is relatively modest compared to the influence of the actual application method. So all in all, UAV spraying shows clear environmental benefits, particularly in energy-related impacts, but the final performance, again, depends a lot on how the spraying is carried out, which is the application method, how long the equipment lasts, and how emissions behave in the environment. Again, and I'll try to be very briefly, let's see what drives these impacts. In the conventional system on the left, we see that impacts are dominated mainly by the air blast sprayer, which includes the considerable use of diesel for its operation, which is the one driving most of the impact categories by a considerable percentage. You can see it in the left figure in green, sorry. By contrast, in the drone system, this changes slightly. Machinery becomes less important. Impacts are more distributed among different elements or inputs. And what we see is a shift from a system driven by fuel and machinery in the conventional system to one driven more by mechanical inputs and emissions, direct emissions, because they have a bigger weight, if you want, in the overall performance. However, in the drone system, we also see in yellow how the UAV component itself, with all the emissions linked to its manufacturing, appear and are important in some areas like ozone depletion or climate change. In terms of conclusions, Let's say that use case 2 shows how the UAV spraying presents clear environmental advantages, especially in energy-related impacts, mainly due to replacing of diesel with electricity. However, again, there are some trade-offs, particularly in freshwater ecotoxicity linked to how emissions are distributed rather than increased chemical use. Again, extending the drone lifespan helps, but the biggest gains probably don't come from here. So there's an improvement, but it's small. Probably there's some room here to also consider the use of renewable energies as a mitigation strategy to improve the performance in those categories where it shows a worse result compared to the conventional system. That said, let's move on to the next use case. The next use case focuses on livestock monitoring, where we, again, are comparing a conventional way of doing livestock monitoring over extended areas against a drone supported system. The functional unit, again, is similar to the other ones. It's more service-based and focused on the monitoring service delivered over 1 year. And the boundaries are the same. We use the cradle, so the beginning of the extraction of production, transformation, transport, up to the service gate, up to the moment the service is provided. Here we focus on 3 key scenarios, if you want. We have a fully conventional system that uses a pickup vehicle. We have a hybrid system that was implemented that combine alternatively vehicle and drone. And we have included in this study an hypothetical drone-only scenario, which is only exploratory at this point, because it helps us understand better maybe the full potential of using drones in this field. The key difference, as we'll see, across all these scenarios is the extent to which vehicle use can be reduced or replaced by drones. And here we have the results. In use case 3, we see a different pattern compared to the previous use cases. Here, I'm actually, sorry, I think in the previous slide I made a mistake. We're considering 4 scenarios. We have the conventional in blue. In orange, we have this alternating pickup drone. In green, we have a drone monitoring system that uses a pickup only for going to the mission starting point. So it's the scenario with the minimum driving, which is more realistic. And then in blue, clear blue, you would see this hypothetical only drone system. So starting with the hybrid scenarios, we see that not all drone integration strategies lead directly to improvements. In the second scenario, in orange, where vehicle and drone are used alternatively, we alternate them, sorry, the system actually performs worse than the conventional approach across most impact categories. This is because the vehicle still, as we'll see in the hotspot analysis, the main source of impact is heavily used. You still use the pickup several days per week, and the other days you use the drone, while we are also adding the additional burden of all the materials, production and energy need to produce a drone. So instead of replacing impacts, we are effectively adding like another layer of impacts. In scenario 3, when the drone monitoring is combined with the minimum needed driving, but we still need some driving because this pickup needs to go to the point where the drone operation can start. We start to see some improvements compared to the conventional system. You see them in the dark green, particularly in those more energy-related categories like climate change or fossil resource use. And this reflects this reduction in diesel consumption. As I said, we also tested this sorry, forgot to mention, we also tested different lifespan assumptions but they're not reflected here for the purpose of doing it shorter, also because the influence was relatively small compared to the vehicle use. So let me see. Yes, I was saying we have this more hypothetical scenario in blue when we move to a drone-only scenario. This means if at some point we are able to do this kind of operations with the drone flying from the farm base to all the area of the farm, uh, without any driving involved, what we would see is a very large reduction across all impact categories. And this is due mainly to being able, in this hypothetical scenario, to eliminate the use of diesel, which is the dominant contributor here for almost all the environmental impacts. So the key idea, message, or finding from this results is that the drones only deliver strong environmental benefits when they significantly reduce or replace vehicle use and diesel associated to it. Partial integration, as we've seen in some of the scenarios, brings some benefits, but also trades off. So we improve in some areas, but overall we're performing worse. And at the same time, it's important to stress that drone-only scenario is only exploratory. There are still many operational and regulatory constraints that make this difficult, such as coverage of large areas in some farms and flight limitations, which make the full replacement difficult nowadays. However, I think it clearly shows the potential of improvements and reinforces the idea that the more we can reduce reliance on vehicles, the greater the environmental benefit that we can potentially achieve. Now, looking again at the hotspot analysis, which shows us where or which are the main drivers of each impact. Across both the conventional and the hybrid system, the dominant contributor is clearly the vehicle. Mainly because, not so much because of the production of the vehicle, more because of the diesel used and combusted. Apologies, in the graphs, they show different colors. I didn't realize. In the conventional system, the diesel production and combustion is red. In the drone one is green. That was a mistake on my side, but they represent the same part. So we see how this is the main driver for almost all impact categories. Here I'm showing you just 4 of them, but this is a pattern across almost all environmental impacts. So again, the main idea or the main finding here is that the vehicle use is the main driver of impacts. So any effort to reduce the amount of kilometers and therefore diesel use is the main lever, if you want, for potential improvements. In terms of conclusions, the hotspot analysis showed that the vehicle use, especially the diesel, is the dominant contributor. In some cases, accounting for almost 70–80% of the impacts. This explains why in some of the scenarios where we add a drone in a hybrid configuration, in which we still use a lot of car, the overall environmental footprint it's worse than the conventional system. The drone in itself, however, has a relatively small contribution, and this explains also why in that hypothetical scenario, when we remove the vehicle, impacts drop significantly. And the key idea to take from here is that, again, vehicle use drives most of the impacts. So any attempts, efforts to create a configuration in which we can further reduce the use of the pickup and consumption of diesel, that would be a big lever of improvement. Now, moving on to use case 4 for forestry monitoring. This use case consists actually, in reality, of 3 different subcases. One has to do with forest health monitoring, another with wildfire risk monitoring, and another one with wildlife monitoring. It wasn't possible for us. We first attempted to have like an overall one system, but they were quite different in themselves, so we had to break them down. Eventually, we proceeded to create or to perform an environmental impact assessment of the first two. Unfortunately, it was not possible to do the wildfire monitoring assessment due to very little available data, especially regarding to a conventional way of doing that activity. And this comparison was kind of the essence of our study. So we focus our efforts on the first two. So I'm going to present them separately. What we see here, sorry, my screen. So in this use case, the first part, use case for A, focuses on forest health monitoring, where we compare a conventional forest inspection, where engineers travel across forest areas, with a drone-based approach that uses drones equipped with sensors to capture images and processes and then determine or diagnose those areas that are affected. The key point here is that both systems still rely heavily on vehicles. So here we are in a similar situation as in the previous use case, but also the drone system, because we still use a lot of vehicle, it's like adding an additional layer of impacts. We also tested different lifespans assumptions for both the vehicle and the drone, although we'll focus mainly on the drone component, is the main source of interest in this project. But I'll focus on the main comparison to keep things clear. So let's try and see here the results. So here I explain which are the main scenarios we consider. So we have a conventional system, a system in which a vehicle and UAV are used with their shorter lifespans, one in which the vehicle and the UAV have the longer lifespans, and one in which the vehicle has a shorter and UAV a longer lifespan. I know this is a bit confusing, but here, since we didn't have that much information about the use of the vehicle, we needed to kind of factor in that a vehicle, depending on where it's used, the kind of terrain, and so on, can also have a variation in their lifespan. So I'll show you here some graphs. I'm not sure if they are so clear, but looking at the results, the pattern is mainly that differently from the other use cases, across all impact categories, the drone-based system performed worse than the conventional system. This probably seems a bit counterintuitive, also for us, when we obtain these results, because drones are often seen as a more efficient technologies in some fields. So we were hoping that we could see at least some improvements in some areas, in some categories of impact. But in this case, as a conclusion, we can say the key issue was that the drone does not manage to replace enough of the main source of impact, which is the vehicle. The drone monitoring still relies on big distances that need to be covered by car from a city to the forest and then within the forest. So this ends up adding a new layer of equipment, energy, and materials, which reflects on high environmental impacts. So rather than reducing impacts, we see that this specific configuration of drone use effectively adds a second system on top of the existing one, if you want. Here, maybe to help explain this a bit better, again, we look at the hotspot analysis to see what drives the impacts. And in all, these are only the drone configurations. Obviously, in the conventional system, it's mainly the car and the diesel that is driving impacts. When we include the drone layer, we see that the vehicle and the use of diesel consumption is still very high. We see it in this light blue across most impact categories. And on top of this, we are including or adding impacts from the electricity needed for the drone and the processing and all the drone components. So again, instead of replacing impacts, the drone system adds to this layer of heavy impacts of the car and diesel. Unlike use case 3, we couldn't realistically model here a reduced driving scenario, mainly due to the complexity and variability of the real monitoring operations. So in use case 3, we work with one specific farm where our use case leader and the farmer were implementing these different practices, and they did a great job kind of recording all distances, diesel, and so on. So that allowed us to create this scenario. When it comes to forest monitoring, it's like a big body of people working on this, long distances, not always the same distances. So yeah, we try to find a way of finding a more realistic scenario for this, but I think there were too many assumptions to make it really solid or strong enough. So a few conclusions to repeat or to summarize what I just explained. The drone system increases the impacts across all categories, mainly because there's not that or enough substitution of vehicle and diesel use. The lifespan difference, so extending the lifespan of the drone, which we also tested, improved results, but very slightly, and it's not enough to overcome the difference with the conventional system. But again, there's some important limitations in this study, in the sense that we were able to explore a more simplified conventional system due to this forest health monitoring operations being way more complex than the data we managed to obtain. So the conventional system here involves, sorry, I got lost. Yeah, so forest health monitoring is much more complex. That's what I wanted to say, that we were able to capture. So if further research could focus on trying to get more detailed data on how these conventional operations are done, I think it would help to generate a better or fairer comparison. Now, moving on to the wildfire risk monitoring, which is this use case 4B, if you want, in which we look at wildfire risk monitoring, which is a more intensive and large-scale activity than the forest health monitoring. So here we compare conventional patrol-based monitoring with a drone-based system. Here we've included in this presentation only the most favorable scenario for the drone system with a longer lifespan for simplification. Because we'll see again that the results are quite similar to the previous one, in the sense that even under the best case assumptions for the drone system performs significantly worse. For instance, in terms of climate change impacts, we've seen a result of more than 10 times higher than the drone in the drone system. And this is not a marginal difference, it's a structural one. Again, if we were to look at the drivers of impact, we'll see that there are two key reasons behind this result. First, there is a very large difference in scale. The conventional system covers a very large area with impact spread over many more hectares. A big effort was done to try to get as much data as possible from the conventional system, and some estimates were obtained in terms of driving distances and resources used by these engineers. But some other important aspects couldn't be fully taken into account, and that includes considerable training efforts, differences between smaller and bigger monitoring activities or operations. All of them entail important driving distances as well, and that we couldn't fully factor it in. So I'm afraid that we have, let's say, underestimated the impacts of the conventional system. The second key reason is that the drone system still relies heavily on vehicle use, while again we're adding this additional layer of inputs that translate in impacts that have to do with electricity consumption and drone infrastructure. So again, we are not really replacing impacts, we are adding them, but over a much smaller monitor area, so to speak. So in terms of conclusions, the drone system shows significantly higher impacts in this specific configuration, mainly driven by difference in scale and how impacts are allocated per hectare. Vehicle use remains the main hotspot, and the drone system adds further impacts without replacing it. This use case did not include a reduced driving scenario either, which could change the picture for the same reason that I mentioned before. We didn't have enough data to create a realistic scenario. And that said, I think there is still a clear potential for further research in this area, especially trying to get more detailed information about the full conventional system, and that would help create maybe a fairer comparison. But also in terms of the drone deployment, I think that further operation configurations can be explored in terms of how one trip up to a forest can include several monitoring operations. That's something we try to factor in our drone system, but it was again complicated, so there were important limitations in this point. So as a general conclusion, I think the comparison is not fully representative of real operations, and that's why we have this not very insightful, if you want, result. But still, I think it's worth to do this kind of exercises and have like a first step that show us what is the situation we are, and then we can more easily identify those areas where further effort, data, and research is needed. And that said, since we're almost out of time and we can maybe have some questions, just a final reflection in terms of how can these results be useful for you or for anyone who attends this webinar, and how can they be useful in practice. And let's say that, first of all, LCA helps identify, as we've seen in some of the examples, about what really drives environmental impacts. Across all use cases, we consistently saw that a few key elements like fuel use, chemical inputs, energy source dominate the results. And this is important because it allows us to focus our efforts on those specific aspects where we are trying to improve the environmental footprint. Second, it helps avoid unintended trade-off. As we've seen, introducing new technologies like drones does not automatically reduce impacts. In some cases, in most cases, it can even increase them if it's not implemented carefully. So LCA helps us make these trade-offs visible and guide us in how we decide in the implementation of these new technologies. Third, it supports better system design. This links with the previous point. For example, many of the improvements we observed were not just about the technology in itself, but about how it is used. So focusing on reducing driving, optimizing operations, switching to renewable energy, all practical aspects that can help focus or direct our efforts to where it matters more. Fourth, it provides a solid basis, I think, for decision-making and investment, whether you are thinking or developing solutions, advising stakeholders, or trying to scale up technologies. LCA contributes or allows you to compare alternatives in a way that it's more structured and transparent. And finally, it helps, how to say it, build a more, if you want, credible sustainability claim. In a context where environmental performance is increasingly important, we have it everywhere. Having a strong database assessment is key for trust and compliance, even as we've seen in some of our cases when we have studies with limitations. As long as you can identify and report on those limitations, that's an improvement, let's say, because as I said, LCA can be like a very step-by-step process. So if you've done this first step with your limitations, someone else can build on that. So I think this is already bringing something to the table. And overall, I would say that the main message here is that LCA is not just a reporting tool, but it can be a decision support tool as well that helps you guide your decisions, your choices, and walk towards a more sustainable practices. And that said, I think this is the end of my presentation. And if there were any questions that someone wanted to make.
Morning. Hello.
Hello.
I just wanted to thank you for this opportunity and for the contribution you gave us. There are a lot of topics to think about, so we will make a treasure of your presentation and we will read it carefully. I hope we will receive it soon. As
Absolutely,
usual.
yeah.
As usual.
We're
You're-
working on the final report, and there will
Yeah.
be all this more detail. Here we try to give like a snapshot,
Great.
but definitely it will be available and public.
Thank you so much.
No, please, thank you.
Good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bruno. I guess we can wrap it up.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone, and have a good day.
You too.
Do we need to take a picture or something, Mackenzie? Or
I took one at the start. If you...
okay, perfect. Okay then.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye,
Thank you.
Catherine.
Bye.